Welcome to my podcast, Shaping Your Journey. My name is Aldo Matza, percussionist, drummer, and artistic director of Kosa Music, inviting you to listen in on conversations with friends, artists, professionals, and experts in our music world. Today, I have the great, and I mean great pleasure of having one of my dear friends on the other coast, North American coast in Los Angeles, great pianist, composer, Joachim Horsley. Yo, thank you
Hi,
so
how are
much
you,
for,
Aldo?
I'm great.
Thank you for having me here, man. I appreciate it.
No, this, you've had quite a journey, and before we get on to the whole journey thing, I want to ask you just one question. Like, go way back. Where did it start for you, musically speaking? And then we can talk about like where you've taken yourself in this journey. So what started it for you? What were the sparks? What was the first thing?
Well, I think the way to start is my older brother, who's about 5.5 years older, was a great pianist. He's a very talented young kid. So when he was 9, he was playing boogie woogie like for real, and I was like 4, and I would just love it, and I'd want to do everything like him. So I would dance around the living room. I would play on the top part of the piano while he was there. He would tell me like the key notes to hit, and I would just like probably hammer on C over and over again if he's playing a C blues, that kind of thing. And that's how it started. I just loved dancing. I loved music. Not that I dance well, don't get me wrong. That's never been something I figured out. But I loved basically that. I loved that. And we had a really musical household. It was kind of like two hemispheres. You know, my mom was the classical one, opera on Saturday every weekend, like the opera broadcast. And my dad was the one who had a little bit more of the eclectic taste. And probably the reason why I got interested in world music in general is because my dad, whose name is Alan, bought the Paul Simon record, Graceland, and he liked the song You Can Call Me Al. And I think we bought it on a tape driving from Hartford back to Boston, visiting my cousins. And that was the first time I'd heard like anything like close to African music. And I was like, whoa, what's going on? And it wasn't just, of course, the amazing ensembles that he had. It was the
Yes.
way he was singing, the way he was telling a story, everything about that album. I don't think I said anything for the whole car ride. We listened to the tape back and forth. And I thought it was I just never heard anything like that. I'd been listening to Boogie Woogie, Beatles, and, kind of like the pop things that were happening at the time. But when that record came out, it was like a beacon where I said, I've got to explore music outside of the United States. That was pretty much, I had a strong feeling that I would really fall in love with music that was not the kind of things that all my friends in grade school were listening to. I was growing up in Brookline, Massachusetts. So I didn't have any Caribbean friends at the time. I didn't have anyone who's really like telling me about any Caribbean music, any salsa music, any music from Africa, nothing, right? So at that point, it was so fresh and new, and it was so exciting that it really started this attitude I had, which was, I've got to go find music. I've got to go find music. And for whatever reason, that to me has been kind of sort of my meaning of life answer. Like if people say, what's the meaning of your life? And to me, it's like, I get excited about life when I'm learning about new music and finding new approaches and new angles, and like going down the rabbit hole of music from certain places and just checking out the connections between Angola and Martinique and all that stuff. All that stuff is really exciting to me. And that's kind of been what's driven me. And I guess the reason why I came into film scoring eventually is because it's the story of all this stuff that excited me. And the story of music is so interesting. And so I felt like storytelling was, I guess, an intricate part of the way I wanted to do music. And, once I really kind of got the idea that film scoring was a profession that could happen, I was like, well, this is great, because that's storytelling. That's all it is. It's storytelling.
Yeah.
It's what I like to do anyway. So it just felt natural, I guess. But I skipped over a lot of parts in the middle. But that was the beginning and the and the reason.
and then you studied. Were you you're in Boston studying?
Yeah, I grew up in Boston. I basically took private lessons, classical music probably till ninth grade, and then I started studying jazz in high school. I ended up going to Skidmore College and studying jazz there with Chris Brubeck, who was Dave Brubeck's son. He was a really important teacher. He kind of, because I was playing so much like boogie woogie, and you could say like raucous jazz, like to study with the Brubeck guy, he was all about inner voicings and being cool. And of course, it was him where I really started to realize the importance of having some grace in your playing. Even though I was aware of that with the classical sensibilities that I played and liked, it was really, I could understand that there was a way to kind of, it was really like the tasteful jazz that I think we all love. That's really what he was trying to get me to do. And that made that was like a whole direction change in terms of kind of growing up, you know what I mean? Growing up into, I think, more sophisticated composition, you could say, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah. No, it's nice.
yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because you have this image already. I've written it, and when we're playing, we're telling a story anyway, right? And to be able to tell that same story, but to a film or to some visual sequence, that's
Yeah,
even more interesting because you have to be on the other side and says, will that image, is this going to support that image? That's
totally.
really, and you're really good at it. I mean, I've been listening to a lot of the stuff you're doing for Disney, and um, the Batman thing. What was that green? A big city green.
Big City Greens. Yeah, that's the Disney show I work on. Yeah, so that's great. I that on that show in particular, we're actually in our 4th season of that show, and it's a lovely show. The showrunners are really great, and each 11-minute episode is kind of like its own little movie.
Okay.
And part of the comedy of the whole thing is, the whole setup is it's this country family that's trying to adjust to city life. And that's just it. That's it. And so everything becomes like an amazing adventure. Going to the mall for the first time, going to get like a soda at the 7-Eleven for the first time becomes this epic adventure. And so even though it's obviously a kid's show, we never treat it like something. I don't know. Sometimes with kids' music, people almost think of it as like a throwaway thing, and they don't put as much care and detail. That's not the case with this. Like we treat it like a very detailed drama, and every aspect of the production is like that. I mean, it's a comedy, but for example, like there's a whole episode where the lead character Cricket, who refuses to wear shoes because he's a country boy, isn't allowed in like this 7-Eleven to get the soda that every kid wants, and It has a showdown essentially with the clerk. And so the musical journey, which accompanies the story journey, is like this epic thing ending with this like big Les Mis style Broadway number where he finally surrenders and decides to wear his sister's shoes and walk 20 steps. And of course it ties into like all these kinds of bigger themes based on this kind of pedestrian experience. So that's the comedy of it. So we have a chance to go over the top with the music, and sometimes things are just like very subtle and detailed. Anyway, it's just a great fun thing. It's a fun because there's no bounds. You can do any kind of music on that show. I mean, we do everything, epic orchestra stuff, Latin music, other things, like everything in between. It's just crazy. So there's all sorts of stuff in there. Yeah.
It reminds me a little bit of, I mean, I remember when I was a kid, really young, watching the Beverly Hillbillies.
Yeah,
It's like
exactly.
that kind of thing, right?
Yeah,
It's just
yeah.
funny to
Exactly.
watch.
Exactly. So we call these fish out of water stories, like where someone's in a whole new context, and those are always gonna. This is just this version is a fish out of water story for sure. So that's a fun thing to write music for, because you're always kind of playing with expectations, and maybe, comedy, I think, is all about subverting expectations, and I think even the reason you laugh is because something happened that you really didn't expect, and your brain hasn't like adjusted to the reality of the contrast between what you expected and what's happened, and that results in laughter. And
Right.
and so like in music we do that too, right? We create contrast and surprises, and we try to set somebody up to hear something, and then we do something else, as a way to sort of tease the audience member. And so it's really fun. So in general, working in comedies is fun in this way because you feel like you get a chance to do kind of everything, you know? So it's
Right.
neat. Yeah.
Like, did you study scoring for film, or was that something like so totally pulled you in, and that's what you had to do? And
No, I didn't study. When I was graduating undergrad, I didn't even realize there were programs like the wonderful program in USC out here where you could study film scoring. I didn't even know that. I mean, I was just an East Coast kid, and I didn't really know how awesome the film scoring, training was. But what I did do is I worked as a production assistant in New York starting around 2003, 2002, and in 2002 with a guy named Rob Kahn, and he was writing music for jingles and I worked as his Pro Tools engineer, basically like a PA job, And so I was, taking out the trash, making coffee, running Pro Tools stuff. And at night, he would let me like occasionally write a few demos if there was like a wide call for a McDonald's commercial or something like that. He would let me, kind of just on my own time throw a demo in the ring. And of course, I didn't win any of the first 10 jobs that happened, but I kept demoing and I kept getting feedback and I saw what the other writers were doing. And I'm a decent chameleon. So like when people are doing something that's really cool, I'm like, okay, I got to figure that out. And basically, I just trialed and errored it, with commercials and promos, which is what his work was at the time. And then eventually, I won a few small jobs here and there, and from there, started doing short films and then independent feature films. And then I had some things that went to Sundance and like short films. And then when I was there, other composers who were there said, if you want a career, you really got to be in Los Angeles because this is where the work is. And I think they were absolutely right because in 2009, when, the financial world kind of fell apart, I was freelancing for a bunch of jingle houses. But as their business contracted, they stopped calling their freelancers. So where their business went from 100% to 80%, my business went from 100% to 0%. All of a sudden, there was no phone calls, and my wife Lisa was pregnant at the time with Desmond, who's now 13. And so I decided to do a composer workshop, an ASCAP composer workshop in summer of 2009. We drove across the country. And by the time we got to like Eastern Kentucky, this is a chance. She's pregnant. We're driving, and stopping every 2 hours because she has to pee. We had a lot of time to talk, about what life is going to be like. And of course, we were like, why do we live in New York? Why are we paying $13.50 for a half gallon of milk? And, taking cab drivers driving by us telling us to get a haircut, like the whole city is rough and everyone knows it. But there's a certain point where, it's like that Monty Python skit. Like I came here for abuse. That's how New York is. And I felt like, like the money had fallen out of the system, and all of a sudden New York was not a fun place for that summer. So we were like, let's go to LA, and it was like a whole other world. Aside from the fact that Lisa was throwing up every morning, we had like a great summer. and we decided we're going to stay. Like we're going to just do LA, and we kind of never looked back. I mean.
Yeah.
That was it.
But it's funny that when it seemed like against all the odds, your determination, you said, no, we got to get there. And
right.
Even if the thing doesn't move, you're still going to get there.
Oh, totally. And honestly, it's a bit of a cliche, but problems are definitely opportunities. And, even when something dreadful happens, it's not that you can't be devastated, but it is a time to go, okay, let's see you have to find the opportunity, after a moment of taking stock, you have to see, okay, what's the opportunity here? And there's always some small opportunity. And I think that's a good way to keep yourself from veering off the track, because it's rough out there in music. It's rough out there in film music. It's in all aspects, and I think most people who have jobs in music are just grateful to have a job, and they just try to keep going. And that's how it is. So yeah.
And the thing is, there's no such thing as a coincidence. You decide to do something, like you showed up, you went to these workshops, you went to where you had to go, and then the trip across the country to LA. That's a good one, because I know some people who did that. Some very successfully slept in their cars for a while until the thing kicked off, and now like they've done so well with that
right.
Had they caved at that moment, at that very delicate moment, that would have never happened.
Right.
And you have to have the mindset for it, and understand that that's what it is, and build a certain level of Teflon, I suppose, to
Mm-hmm.
say, okay, and then
Yeah.
like you said, you said it well. Any adversity is really a test, and if you can see the opportunity, turn it upside down, and say, oh,
Yeah.
yes, this is awful, but wow, this is going to allow me to do X, which would not have
Right.
otherwise happened, right?
Yeah, totally. That's absolutely right. And there are a lot of scary moments like that. There are a lot of scary moments like that. And I think what I wasn't prepared for with music is how much time you have to be alone. That was something I didn't really appreciate, like when I was leaving college. You have to spend an enormous amount of time alone with your work, wondering, and you have to be very careful because if you're editing while you're creating, it's really self-destructive. It's like putting a Lego together and then ripping it apart every second. It's like you don't actually make anything. For me, I really have to like be very forgiving to myself when I create and just say, it's okay if this is all shit. If I spend 4 hours doing something that's completely trash, that means I got rid of that trash that I had to create so that the next session is going to be productive. And it's just part of the process. And it's super frustrating because sometimes you're like, okay, I got the whole day to write, no phone calls, no meetings. And then it's not a very productive day and you go to sleep feeling bad. But that's happened enough to me where I realize you just don't have some days. Some days are kind of, they seem like they were kind of a waste, but they were really important because that's what you needed to do to get to the next day where everything's great, or the day after, or maybe the next week. But point is, you have to go through the muck, I think is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Alone, and you go through it alone. You don't always have someone there like cheering you on. I mean, it's important to do that. And I guess I'm more of like a naturally extroverted person. So if I'm not around people, I lose energy a little bit. So anyway,
Oh no, no,
so
I totally hear. That reminds me of when I was my first year university. I mean, I wasn't a reader. But I knew what had to be done. So I had a
yeah,
lot of catching up to do, and I spent hours. By the time you learn to actually how to practice to get,
right,
now you can do in an hour what you would do in a week.
right, right,
But back then, when in the beginning, for me, it was incredible because I decided to do this later on in a later stage, and I was
yeah,
at university, and I saw these people playing and reading, and I said, "Oh my God!" So I was doing like 8 hours a day, sometimes into the night,
mm.
and I would watch my friends skating along the Ottawa Canal,
Ah,
and then they would knock on the door, says, "Are you finished yet?" and join me. I said, "Nope." So they
wow,
would have their Friday night fun, and I would be practicing. And you're so
yeah,
right about all that time alone.
I know.
That if you don't do it,
It's not there. It's not there. Yeah, and it seems like it's endless. Like I still have to, I struggle to make sure I have a good practice routine, and it's like trying to keep that time that's unperturbed where you just do your work at the instrument is a challenge every day. And I think I miss the days when, I was young and I could play 8 hours,
yes,
I
oh
haven't made one of
yes,
those in a
oh
long time, but and so we do our best, to get it in and stay committed. But
yeah.
yeah,
I mean,
so
what you have this other thing that I really enjoy is like this curiosity. I mean, we're all curious and we're always saying,
mm,
okay, what's under this hood? And I need to find this other thing that you have in your mind. And I'm referring to, of course, when you and I met,
yeah,
you had called me
yeah,
and said you were already doing a lot of work for Disney, and
yep,
you said, "Well, I compose this Cuban kind of stuff, but I don't really feel like I own it. I don't feel like
exactly.
I possess it." So I heard about your programs in Cosa Cuba programs, study programs in Havana, and you came.
Yeah, that's right, and it was amazing. Let me give you. I don't know if I ever told you the context of when I first called you, but what had happened. My friend Sergio Bellotti, who was drummer in my band Little Horse, which I played with my brother several years past. I think when I called you, I think it was either the end of 2014 or the beginning of 2015, and because Sergio had recommended your program in Cuba, and the context was when I was studying jazz growing up, I was learning jazz with my teacher from the real book, which is very good to get going and get the sense of what's going on. But the one problem with the real book, and many people have discussed this, is when it gets to the Latin tunes, if you don't understand the difference between Brazilian and Cuban music, it can get really confusing.
Yeah.
For example, or Brazilian and Venezuelan music, or Colombian, right? All these countries' folkloric music is different. Cuban music, I think it's safe to say, is probably the most popular music from Latin America and the United States, maybe Cuban music and merengue, of course, because of the salsa phenomenon, right? And the huge wave of immigrants, right? And I'm sure that could probably be debated, but let's just say it's hugely popular, right? And so a lot of our commercial exposure is salsa music, which of course is derived, as we learned when I did your program, from Cuban music. And I sort of understood that superficially, but really understanding how the piano fits into the gears of the way the Cuban ensembles work, I really hadn't had that detail study at all. And I loved Henry Mancini, for example. I was really into Henry Mancini, like as a film composer, and a lot of those Latin tunes that Henry Mancini does, it's kind of like an American sound with a Latin flavoring. It's not like authentic groove stuff where it's really everything's in the right position, like you would hear it with Los Baman, right? So that really wasn't there in Henry Mancini's music. So that's my first exposure to sort of Latin film score. And so if you don't know that that's the context that Mancini was writing, then of course you might learn Latin music a little wrong, and this is a phenomenon I find all the time. It's like when you hear a modern band of any kind using Latin music, they're already 10 steps ahead of the basic stuff. And if you don't understand what they're doing and where they came from, you might miss some key parts of how to put music together, which of course is basically the big advantage to going to Cuba with you in the Cosa Music program, which of course I'm eternally grateful for and totally changed my life, as you know.
Yeah. No, that was fantastic because I mean I'm like the preacher. I say Cuban music, and especially when we're talking about the clave. I mean, I don't want to take 3 hours talking about the clave right now, but it is so essential. And then when you hear people say, well, the clave is a rhythm you play in Cuban music. Then you get my goat, And I tell people, the clave is like amoeba, is like the essence of music, essence of life.
Right.
For all music, not just Cuban music. It's just it's a lot more intricate because all the parts have to fit a certain way to each other.
Right.
And it's all based on the clave, which is the melody in the first place.
So can we talk about that actually for a second? Because
absolutely.
When I studied with you, of course, a lot of Cuban musicians, when they describe this to, say, non-Latin musicians, right? They'll say, in Cuban music, the clave is the spine. This is the rhythm that everything is based on. So when you have the clave and the style, everybody in the band essentially knows what to do, because this is the fundamental. And so, since you and I were studying Cuban music, I started doing starting with the piece Beethoven in Havana, which of course is Beethoven done in a Cuban style. I started experimenting with, basically I would meet people from other Latin American countries like Venezuela and, of course, the French Caribbean countries like Martinique and Guadeloupe. And the clave is there in all their music, right? And it's not necessarily as explicit as it is in many Cuban styles, but it's there. And interestingly, it's there in cumbia too. But when you talk to cumbia musicians, they're not preoccupied with the clave in the way that Cubans are to some degree. But for me, as an American arranger who's essentially an interloper in all these different worlds, I think it's actually really important to understand Cuban music because the clave is so explicit, so that when you move on to other, let's say, other cultural musical offerings, you can understand the context. And essentially, they're all African cousins, right? So they have this context that's all the same. And understanding that for me was I mean, infinitely valuable, right? Because of I'm really able to basically come into, let's say new music from Colombia, which I absolutely love. And I have a certain context where, if I had to quickly work with that arrangement, I would understand, where to put the piano, where to put the melody. Even if I didn't necessarily know all the details of that rhythm, I could
Sure.
leave it up to the expert percussionist, but I could manage to add a creative concept in an arrangement that would work. So
Yeah.
I guess in a way, if I would say what I really learned is that if you're not from Latin America and so you didn't grow up with these things, studying Cuban music is a great gateway to kind of unlock an understanding, at least like a topical understanding. Not it's
Mhm.
maybe it's impossible to get a full deep understanding of all the cultural music from all the countries in Latin America, but studying Cuban music is a great way to, I guess, set up a framework for understanding Latin music in general.
Yeah.
I would say.
And
Would you
I
agree with that? Do you think that's true?
absolutely, and I would even add more to that because it's not confined to just the South American or Middle American.
Yeah.
It's also essential learning,
Hmm.
structural learning in the composition point from a composition point of view for classical music, for jazz, for
Hmm.
pop, everything, all those musics, except with the exception of perhaps classical contemporary music and
Hmm.
Indian classical music. Apart
Yeah.
from those two, the concept of clave, which it comes from the motherland to begin with,
Hmm.
Africa,
Right.
and went to all of these different places, including the classical world. Any melody is actually built on a clave. You don't
Right.
they don't do it consciously, but it's the call and response, the tension release, that whole concept, which is a 5 note phrase
Right.
in some form. So
Right.
that whole idea, and it's like a jazz musician really needs to learn the blues
Right.
first, then everything else makes sense. Well,
Right.
for me, everybody should learn Cuban music first,
Hmm. Hmm.
or at the same time that they're learning everything else, including classical pop, jazz, everything, because then
Yeah.
that changes your whole frame of composition, therefore improvisation. And that
Right.
2 bar phrase that we call 2 bar phrase, called
Right.
clave, is that unit that we base our phrasing on anyway. So
Right.
this really forces us, just like the 12 bar blues, gives us that framework to work from. Would you
Hmm.
agree with that?
Oh, of course. And I think you're absolutely right. I think the whole idea of a two bar phrase, it's almost like, I think the best way to think about it is it's the most basic sentence structure of music. That's kind of how I see it. So yes, even in Bach, and if you go back to like the early dance music of Europe, like the gavotte and things like that, the phraseology, maybe it doesn't accent like Latin music, of course, but I think conceptually that you have a call and response, an A and a B, A and a B, A and a B, and that is a way for music to be digestible to human beings somehow,
Yeah.
and like, when we so I mean, when I studied jazz, we weren't talking about that, and of course I agree, we absolutely should have been when I was learning, but we were talking about phrasing, and when I would hear a great, let's say Oscar Peterson solo, as a student, I was really impressed by, the technique. But the thing about him is it's never, for example, because he was a master, he's always thinking in phrases, and all the licks and stuff like that, they fit into cogent phrases that you can understand. So his solos sound like melodies, and even though they may be complicated, it comes from the same concept that a composer like, say, Irving Berlin, was writing, phraseology, right? So I think yes, I think I see that you're absolutely correct. Of course, having really studied that through your program and then continued further with understanding how the clave is really just kind of the scaffolding for phraseology, right? That's kind of how I would say it. It's like the the poles in the tent, right? For setting up the phrase.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, it's really, really important. During the pandemic, when I was teaching my kids music, we decided to do homeschool for a year, which was the best and worst thing we ever did.
Oh
And
boy. Yeah.
teaching music was challenging, but we did actually, we studied the clave, and we studied clapping to it, and we studied the whole idea of phraseology and call and response. And I used that concept as you've described to really just say everything's a phrase, everything's, this and this. And I think they did get that, and so Bodhi, who's I got Bodhi and Desmond. Desmond's playing ukulele and Bodhi's playing flute. So they do kind of get that. They do kind of get that. Do they still rush? Yes, they still rush. But every kid in
Of
America
course.
is still rushing.
No,
And
no, of course. But it's a great foundation to have. And I think in universities and programs, they should have both. It's kind of not neglected. It's not well understood by
yeah,
the academic institutions. I mean, finally, they're studying jazz, which is fabulous. You should
right.
have classical and jazz. And that third element that should always be there in my book is
Yeah,
Cuban music. And
of
then that will
course.
take you to Africa, and then Venezuela, and then all of those Brazilian, and then
Totally.
their whole connection. I mean, for me, when I did my bachelor, I did it in bachelor of. I mean, I was a rock drummer who then went on to study jazz, and I got a double degree in classical percussion
Hmm.
performance as well as jazz
Yeah,
performance. And then I did graduate studies in ethnomusicology because I was really interested, like,
right.
where does this come from, and try and trace it back. And then when I discovered the Cuban, I was studying with people in New York, Frank Malabé and all of these people, the Cuban. But then once I went to Cuba, it like all the lights came on, and I said, "Oh
Yeah,
my God, this should be the starting point."
right, right.
You
Yeah,
know,
that's so interesting. Do you think that I mean, do you think that the reason that we don't have a lot of Cuban music right alongside the classical music training that a lot of people get early on is because, ultimately the institution of music was just from Europe was just around classical music. So like the school just developed around the music of Europe, and everything else is had to enter, you know, high society, or like the culture, the high culture of music. And this folkloric stuff for many years was not considered serious, right? So do you think
right?
that's why, or do you think it's just one person can't know the world, and it takes a long time to learn the world, and or do you think it's like just kind of like an intentional thing, like, oh, that's not the serious stuff, that's the folkloric stuff, you can go learn that on the street, but you go to school to learn Bach, you go to school to learn Beethoven. Do you
I
think that,
think, yeah, no,
what is your opinion on how this came about?
well, that's a really good question. And I often think about this. The Western classical music, of course, having been there for so many years, has become the music that we all study as the base for seriousness. And then I think after many years of the whole jazz tradition that came up in the
Yeah,
60s, with Berkeley and all those other schools,
yeah,
legitimizing more or less in the academic world the need for this. And that became a thing, and it became as important. So those
yeah,
two became the pillars. Now, why music of Africa, of Cuba, and specifically Cuba? Because to me, Cuba is like the reflection of all of those in one place, and then you go
hmm,
backwards and forwards and sideways to learn the rest. But as
yeah,
far as the structural learning of this as a third pillar, that I would, in the light of that question, and is a really good question. It's not that there wasn't a lot of development, and I mean, because you've been to the Dr. Lavo with his presentations,
yeah,
and for me it was magnificent to see that Cuba is not there's like one Cuban music. There are many, many, and many lineages,
yeah,
because Cuba
exactly,
is a musical continent in
yeah,
itself. And then once you learn that, you say this should be the third pillar. But part of the reason why it hasn't, I think it's historical and political. And
Yeah.
because of the situation, with the United States, that kind of
Hmm.
blocked that whole learning from people and having direct access this way. I mean, there was a great deal of back learning. For example,
Hmm.
people would listen to the funk of the States. Changuito
Yeah.
was listening to the funk. The guys here
Yeah.
were listening to the cha-cha, and then
Yeah.
how did the songo come about? Well, that was a marriage of Dave Garibaldi and Tower of Power stuff,
Right.
uh, and then those guys took that to another place.
Yeah.
But you didn't really have that impact on this side just because of the political and historical, all of that.
Yeah.
And a lot of people didn't get to have hands-on like they would jazz, you know.
Yeah.
So
So
I
so
think that
interesting.
that would be my answer. And it's
Yeah.
it's it's too bad. You did have another kind of doorway of that music through a different filter, which was Puerto Rican.
Hmm.
The New Rican, you had
Right.
salsa, which is not Cuban.
Right.
Salsa is the mix of, because Puerto Rico is practically across the street from Cuba.
Right.
So those people who went to New York, a lot of Puerto Ricans in New York,
Mhm.
had learned and played this music, but their way, which is not the same by any means. It's a whole different world, and they mixed it with other things, which is the normal thing that happens in a place like New York, the whole creativity hotbed, which came out as something else. That whole
Right.
salsa thing, and then many people took that as same thing as Cuban, which is definitely not. You know.
Yeah. Let me if I could summarize sort of what happened musically, tell me if you think this is an accurate summarization because I have this conversation and with people and I want to double check my understanding with you here. So with salsa music, is salsa music essentially Cuban music played by Cubans and Puerto Ricans and maybe Dominicans living in New York with other influences there. And the term salsa was kind of like a record label title to like just kind of give it a name so that people kind of knew this was the kind of stuff you were going to get on a quote unquote salsa record. And it's really like son montuno, cha cha cha,
Yeah.
Cuban styles basically kind of commercialized for the American music market, late 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Yeah,
Is
and it
that, is that,
was
is
yeah.
that
I,
it?
I,
Yeah.
I totally agree with you. And it became like one style. Salsa was the son montuno,
Yeah.
turned around and mixed for the because there's so many people who fell in love with it. There's all kinds of street music
Right.
that happened. It was a huge thing in New York. Um,
So when I met with you in Cuba, I had never really heard timba music, and this was 2015. And I remember we went out to the festival that year. I think it was Hoopy was playing, that
yeah,
night. I think he played that night, and Climax played, and I believe Bambaleo played too that night,
could
if I'm
be.
not mistaken. But it was an amazing night for all these bands. I had no context of the history of Timba, and what they were doing, and it was like a brain overload, right? And Timba, I find the story of Timba fascinating. To me, it's like salsa is the date and Timba is the sex after the date.
Oh
It's
wow!
that's how I feel about in terms of like this funk infused, you could say Cuban music that's has funk influences and kind of goes much harder with the grooves than salsa, you could say.
Sure.
But what's amazing to me is that is like as the modern music and with guys like Alain Perez, and then
Yes,
you've got bands like Calle Real in Sweden. I don't know if you know that group, but they're
I
killer.
don't.
They're so killer. You
I
should check
don't.
them out. This is one of my favorite timba bands, and they're basically uh, Cuban and Latin American immigrants in Sweden, and I think some Swedes as well are in the band. But they kill, they absolutely kill, right? And
Hey.
but it's amazing to see that evolution come, and I don't know. I think there's there's a long way to go in terms of like the evolution of how the music, keeps going. But what is clear to me is if you started listening to timba, it's like, I don't know how to say it. It's like, I think it's really difficult for like an American guy like me who grew up in like American suburb to just kind of like figure out like what's going on. Like it's
Oh
exciting,
yeah.
but you don't know where one is. You don't know where to clap when you first hear it. And it's like it's really hard to start with that music. And it reminds me a little bit of, when I bring my wife, who's not a musician, to like the Green Umbrella series, which is the modern music series here in LA, and she sees like a really advanced piece of music. And well, first of all, obviously with a lot of advanced music, it's on the bleeding edge. So some of it, you can't relate to, and some of
Right.
it's brilliant, right? And you're looking for those like gems of the new stuff. Like we're always looking for that thing that was like the Rite of Spring was in,
Right. Right.
in the early 20th century, right? We're
Yeah.
always looking for that new gem. But it's really hard for someone who doesn't have any context to enjoy it. And it's like, there's only so many marriage points I can spend bringing her to a modern music content. You know what I'm saying? It's
Yeah. Yeah.
like she's like, oh
Yeah.
man, am I going to hear this thing that's just cacophonous and I don't understand it? And I don't blame her for feeling that way, because
Sure.
if she
Of
has no
course.
context, how would she possibly enjoy it? And it's interesting with timba. It's similar to me. Um, I love the music so much, and I think that if you don't have the context of where that music comes from, it's tough. It's
Of
tough,
course.
and
Yeah.
it's tough to understand. So I appreciate that I do have the context and I can understand it.
Yeah.
And I feel like, in my dreams with my project, what I would love to do is just make it a little easier for everybody to access, music. And I think by combining classical music
Yeah.
with timba and, music from these folkloric styles like Venezuela and things like that, it's like I just don't think that people have no familiarity with it. Let's just say, the average person who grew up in an American suburb or in rural United States who doesn't really have any exposure to this music at all, they're not necessarily going to go to the big city and hear and go to the cultural music festival. They don't have access to it.
Sure.
They got a busy life like everybody.
Sure.
And
And
I
it's
hope
also
that I really want my music to be like
yeah.
this like very easy bridge that people can say, oh yeah, I know this classical melody. Oh, it's kind of in this new way. Oh, this rhythm's kind of cool. Kind of like the same experience I had with the Paul Simon record. It's like,
Right.
because my dad was a fan of Paul Simon. We understood this guy. He was an American musician who he reached out, and he did us all a huge favor by bringing in these things that we would otherwise not have heard, right?
Sure.
So
Sure.
I think that's super important, especially as we advance as a society, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, no, and what you're doing is I think is fabulous. And you remember my when you came and imagine if somebody is watching a rumba with the Los Muñequitos for the very first time.
yeah,
And I mean, if your brain doesn't get fried and trying to understand anything, but
yeah.
if you're in the context where it's explained and you
Hmm.
know how the parts work together, where it comes from, and all of
Right,
that, then the fear is gone, and then the understanding raises. And just
right.
like you did when you said, "Okay, Aldo, I want to continue studying with you because I have this project I want to do," and then when
Yeah.
I when I heard your Beethoven for the first time, I flipped. I you know
Thanks.
you remember that.
I appreciate it. I really had something to prove when I was doing that though, because I was like, all right, let's just go for the moon. And there are some things in that arrangement that are definitely mistakes, like things I would do differently, like rhythms that I would adjust. But it's too late now. So, but no, but I think there was something about that particular piece where it was like, there's a French word for like means like the boldness of naivete or something like that. Like you're naive and you just like, okay, I'll just dive right in and see what happens. And of course, there are
Yes.
things that there were things that were kind of like incorrect about the arrangement, but it works and it's arrangement, so
Yeah.
it's fine. But I mean, what I did learn as I got deeper into the project is a lot of like rhythmic details and sort of obviously more refined approach to how to put the piano with the rhythm and things like that. But what's fascinating to me is, you know, as I work with other Latin musicians, is everybody has a different how should I say, like the amount of liberty that you can take when you're doing arrangements is really a matter of opinion. And I feel
Right.
like studying in the US, I think in an effort to be respectful to the Cuban styles, my teachers were like, you really gotta like be just there and like this. And this is true. You have to really understand the clave and lock in with that when you're doing that kind of music. And when you're soloing, you can't break free from that. But what was interesting, I found, is that when I went to Cuba and we're talking to Cubans about this, clave is like air to them. Clave is like air to them, right? So they're thinking, they're like already like, okay, yeah, that's cool, but we gotta like think about the we're thinking about melody and things like that. And I could also see that if you're just like really, really strict about the clave and fitting in exactly, that at a certain point, it is actually limiting. Like you're limiting how out there and interesting you can make your music if you're always trying to like be correct for things that have been done in the past. So
Right.
I feel like you have to really have two minds. Like on one hand, you have to be really committed to respecting the tradition and making sure you have like a solid education on what happened so that you know how to do the music. And then you also have to have the mind where you're willing to abandon that rigidity in order to make something that feels fresh. And of course, you can successfully abandon it, or you can flop. And I have lots of arrangements that I've started, and I didn't. It wasn't successful, and I wasn't ready to finish it. So I've decided it's normal for me to have many unfinished, arrangements. It's not like a sign of failure. It's just part of the process to figuring
Right.
out how to do the one that really works. But I do think it is required this like you have to be open, and I guess just you have to be aware of the education and open. I mean, they say this all the time, right? You have to learn all of it and then throw it away and do your own thing.
Yeah.
That's like the ultimate jazz man's mantra, right? So, but
Yeah.
it's interesting how that shows up in how it shows up in my project. I suppose that's what I'm
Yeah.
trying to say.
And
Yeah,
the interesting thing is, if you back up and you look at it, it's when you initiate a program like you did Beethoven in Havana, you're fitting the melody to the clave, but in the end, it's the melody that dictates what the clave is. So you have to
right,
kind of forget the clave, know all about it, but you're
right,
really dealing with melody. So if you compose a melody, I mean, those were composed melodies already. So
right,
now you're
right.
already starting from a different point. Now, if you're composing something new, by the sheer fact that you're creating this melody, it will
Mm-hmm.
automatically have a clave in it. And you can
Yeah,
decide what that will look like because now you know.
right. Yeah,
Right.
that's really interesting. What I'm trying to do with these projects is the way I go is like if I think of a nice melody from Mendelssohn or Scarlatti or something like that, I think I try to like I'll be like listening to that music, then I'll be driving around, town listening to merengue or something like that. And and I try to like sing it naturally, like away from the piano and just see if I can alter the melody a little bit to make me want to dance.
Right.
And usually when I feel like I'm like, oh, okay, this is kind of cool. Like I want to hear this. I try to like, this is something I would like to hear performed, and doesn't exist yet. So it's like, all right, let me see if I can do this, and then I'll maybe go at the piano and try to make it work, and then I'll mock it up with a computer with like some sample rhythms I have and different ideas, or maybe I'll play guitar to it or something like that and see how adaptable it is. And I have found that the 19th century melodies, the romantic melodies, it's really fun to adapt those because their original context is like this, serene, romantic thing,
Right. Right.
like a Tchaikovsky melody or something like that. Like the original context is so dramatic, and when you turn that into a dance piece, and you can achieve the drama and the dance at the same time, to me, that's like the ultimate goal for the project because you can successfully really make people feel both powerful things. Then I think it's that to me is kind of like the musical goal at the moment of that arrangement, you see. Yeah.
Yeah. And it makes it really really fun too. I mean, fun to be able to do that. I mean, I had so much fun playing the music with you after all that. When you invited me to tour Italy and France, and then
That was a great
finally,
time.
I was
I
so
was so glad you could make it.
oh
I remember when we went to Taranto, and I remember when it would give you water with the cappuccino, and this is like a revolution in food service for our American, right? It's like, oh, water, of course you have to drink water before the coffee, and like the Italians have known about this for all time. And then of course you taste the coffee and you start to cry because you never had a good coffee until that exact moment.
yes. Oh, we won't talk about the food because I'll start crying.
I
I'm
know.
going.
Oh,
I'm going there soon. But I mean, it's a thing when people you order an espresso or cappuccino, whatever,
yeah,
but especially espresso, and right away they give you a glass of water, and people would look, well, what's that for? I didn't order water, and I said, well, no, that's to protect the lining of your stomach, and
wow.
also to have this taste go down with it. But
Yeah,
specifically, it's done for health reasons because it
yeah.
does your stomach lining it because you have 10 espressos a day. I mean, I do. So
Oh my
you
God. All
got to
right.
be
So I know how
careful.
you feel about Italian coffee. And of course, I agree that it's amazing, but I'm going to put you on the spot. You get three choices. You tell me which one you're going for:
Okay.
Cuban coffee, Dominican coffee, or Colombian coffee. You
I
got to
would say
choose one. You
Cuban.
can't say you like them all because I already know you probably like them all, but choose one.
Of course. But I would say Cuban. And you know why?
Why?
Because for some interesting reason, and I'm not sure where,
Hmm.
when I was started going to Cuba a lot, they all had, I would see everybody because it is a coffee culture, just like in Italy, in my village.
Yeah.
Everybody had those twist machines.
Hmm.
And not
Hmm.
it wasn't decaf or any other form of coffee or filtered or anything. It was exactly what we the Italians, without the sophisticated machines, the
Yeah.
basic, we're in the same place. And I said, oh my God, I don't have to say I'd like an espresso. I just say, may I have a coffee, please? And that's what you get,
And
just
that's
like
what
in
you get.
Italy.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's amazing. I have this kind of like running joke with some of the musicians I work with, like like if I'm talking to the Colombians, I'm like explicitly drinking Dominican coffee, like while we're having a Zoom call, and be like, this Dominican coffee is just so delicious. Don't you guys love it? And then the next thing you know, next time I see them, they show up with a Colombian bag, like, you need the real stuff, man. I'm like, oh, okay. And so, of course, I'm drinking the Colombian coffee. Next time I'm talking to Dominicans, like, hey, I don't know if you guys know this, but this Colombian coffee is just fantastic. So they show up with the bag of Dominican. And this is just my scam for getting all the great coffee in the world. But the Dominican stuff I find to be particularly interesting. And I'm convinced that its strength is the reason merengue is so fast. This is like, to me, this is the reason. Like the stuff is like jet fuel. But
Good point.
no,
Yeah,
I'm
because I mean, yeah. I mean, I've been.
but man, I'm really, really so fascinated, like not to be like too academic, but I'm really, really fascinated in how all these different styles of music kind of have their African root with a
Mm.
European, and in Colombia's case, for instance, indigenous mix. And it's really interesting to me to see how it came forward. Did I tell you I went to the carnival in February in Barranquilla?
No, no. Nice.
Have you been there? Have you ever been to
No, I
that?
haven't. I
Oh,
haven't. It's on my
I think
bucket list for sure.
Aldo, I think you would absolutely love it. So, of course, cumbia, the traditional music, there's tons of traditional cumbia with the dancing and the beautiful costumes in the parade. And they do kind of the carnival version of cumbia. So it's like, it's not just, four or five players. It's like a whole marching band with,
Right.
four tamboras. And it's like, it's cumbia ready for war, right? It's like,
Right, right.
and it's so incredible. And I was there visiting two musicians I really like, Jen Del Tambo and Orito Cantora. And I basically said, I was like, please let me come down. They're like, be our guest, come on down. And it was a magical time. Yes, we had amazing coffee, but I did talk to them. I really needed to go because it wasn't like an academic trip, it was a social trip, right? But I needed to just see cumbia for real. And,
Yeah. Yeah.
one thing I really want to try to figure out how to do is get to Venezuela to see some music, and that's definitely on my list. and of course, continuing to go to Cuba and the French Caribbean and all that stuff. I just feel like there's so much incredible music, and I just appreciate seeing the details
Yeah.
of the details of the different folkloric styles and so forth. It's
Amazing.
like
Amazing.
it's amazing. So
Yeah.
anyway, Barranquilla was amazing. It was the first carnival that was fully open since the pandemic. So
Right.
I you
Yeah.
know
I mean,
I
I've been
support.
to Colombia. I
Yeah.
performed in Colombia, in
uh,
Medellin and Bogota.
yeah.
And I've seen some of the artists, some of and it was actually before I got super interested, but
Yeah.
I was taking it all in. I said, I'll have to come back to this,
Yeah.
start with Cuba and then
Yeah.
Africa. And then, I mean, we got you need 10 lifetimes to get all of this, but
Totally.
it's
You
beautiful.
totally do. And so much of that music is still taught orally. And
Yeah.
well, Orito, my friend, she actually made an instructional CD for kids for different Colombian styles, where she turned, ways to play the drums into onomatopoeias with Spanish words. So it's like really
Okay.
easy for kids to learn. And I think she is really the first generation putting it down on paper. A lot of that stuff is learned orally, which is amazing. First of all, if you think about it, I'm like, we don't teach Bach and Beethoven orally, right? It's written down. We use the manuscript. People debate the interpretations and things like that. So with the folkloric stuff, it is really taught orally, and I think then each generation sort of like adds their own style, and maybe that branches off to like a new style. We obviously see that in the evolution of Cuban music to salsa and what it became in the United States. But I think it happens everywhere, right? It's happening
Oh,
all the time.
yes.
It's happening neighborhood to neighborhood.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so it's fascinating to me that music keeps evolving, it keeps changing. And I think when it's orally passed down, I actually think just a theory that it changes much faster because it's oral, and like not
Yeah. And
every not
it
every
doesn't get locked down as a rule. Yeah.
exactly, it doesn't get
And
locked down as a
I
rule.
mean,
It's
I
just,
had I had
yeah.
a great experience like that with our African master that we brought. Repercussion. We had one
Mm,
summer we decided to study African drumming, but we didn't have time. It was complicated to go over there,
of
the
course.
Ivory Coast. So we invited the soloist from the National Ballet in the Ivory Coast, the
Yeah.
dancer, and the lead player. So he spent like 3 months with us all summer, and we were working at this. And I would record it, and work at it at home. Next day at rehearsal, I'd play it, and he'd look over at me, and he'd say, wait, no, no," and he'd play, and I'm looking down at the music, and I'm saying, "But that's what." No, and then he would play it, and I there was a variation that he had changed, and I said, "But
Hmm.
that's what we did yesterday," you know. So then I decided I'm just going to record it, and I'm not going to write it down. I'm not going to
Right. Right.
translate it into our notation because it would lock it in, and he was interested in what he did, where we would take it, you
Yeah.
know. And every day he would come in and see some of the other instruments like my electronic gear or things that I was
Mhm.
fooling around with, and he would bring that in. And I said, no, 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 we want to learn the traditional, but he wanted to take it to another place right there, like you say, in the oral tradition. And I recorded a lot of that
Interesting.
just to have it.
That's so interesting. That makes me think about the when I went to study with you in Cuba, I really picked up on a real difference between, let's say, how Afro-Cuban music with bata drums in the Santeria tradition is like performed. It's not like when we go to a concert, we got a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's more of like this whole evening ritual, as if the music is always playing. It's just that they checked in this one 4-hour period and participated in the river of music that's infinite, and has
Yeah.
obviously all its religious connections with the orishas and all that significance. But to me, what I'm really remarking on here is that sort of Western music that we take for granted. It's like it's very linear, right? It's like we start a song, it has a climax. In pop music we got choruses and so forth, but it has a beginning and an end, and it's that's it.
Right.
But even though physically it's necessary for the music to start and stop when you're hearing it, I felt that the attitude of a lot of Cuban musicians was it more that it was all about getting into a zone, for playing music. And I think the way rumba evolved, and maybe you could comment on this because of course you know the history, that when it evolved in the neighborhoods of Matanzas and Havana, the attitude was more like, this is social music and we're going to like play all night, and people are going to jump in and jump out and sing over this, and we'll play, but it's like an infinite experience, so it'll go on for 8 hours. When it ends is not really what it's about. It's about being in the moment with the music. And that is a very different way of approaching music than us Westerners were, or I should say us Americans, or I'll just say me. I'll just say me. That's very different from how I was raised with music. So that kind of different mentality, which I think I would describe as not only Afro-Cuban, but maybe it's more African in general, is that's really where that comes from, that whole mentality. I find that to be so interesting. It's really eye-opening. And so I guess, I don't know, do you see
Well,
it the way I'm describing it?
yes, and specifically when you're talking about the music that's a derivative of Africa, what some people call Cuban music, or all Cuban music, Afro-Cuban, which is totally false. You
Right.
have music that
Yeah.
has come from Africa, which is the rumba, all of that, and other music that has lineages in Spain and in
Mhm.
France.
Yeah.
And so they're totally different worlds, and that has the form for concert, for dance. The other, which is African based,
Hmm.
all the other forms, the bata, the all of that, and the religious, of course. It's an experience, and it's not set up for a performance for other people to watch. This is a participatory thing, and
Mm.
it has another purpose. And then
Right.
you have the santerias, which is a whole other thing, which is the non-religious is the other side, but
Mm.
using the same structures, the same form, and it just, you're in and out, and it just can go on forever. And it's
Interesting.
and the non-religious one is party music. I mean, rumba was just
Yeah.
party music forever.
Right.
Just right. And
Right.
it's nice to see that difference and to understand those different lineages,
Yeah.
because then it makes you understand the like where it comes from and why this is powerful in its place and this is powerful in its place, and understanding where it's coming from and not treating them all the same. You
Yeah, yeah,
can't.
yeah.
You can't.
So interesting. The other thing, I don't think we've talked about this specifically, but since I started, kind of trying to produce records that would make people want to dance, I had to face this sort of like a production decision. And when I started to really compare salsa records from the 70s, see like you know, uh
Ray Barretto and Tito
Ray Barretto,
Puente.
yeah, Ray Barretto, that's exactly. And compare that to the way Cuban records from the same time. It's really, to me, there's like a big difference between the city playing and the island playing. Big difference, I should say, not big, but subtle enough that the effect was big, right? Like in New York, it feels like we got to get the train on time, like doom doom doo doo doom 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 doo 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 doom gong doo doo gong gong gong, and then it just feels a touch more laid back in Cuba. And it really, to me, it's like these guys are on an island vibe, and it feels different. And it is still technically son montuno or cha cha cha, whether it's called salsa or whether it's given its
Hmm, hmm.
original style name in Cuba. But the playing approach feels a little more laid back. And I was talking to a Cuban musician about this, and his approach was like, he's like, well, yeah, what you got to do is you really got to think about rumba, and when you play with rumba, you have this like kind of triplet imposed over the feel of four. And that was really eye-opening to me as a piano player, because it's like, okay, so
It's like
um
jazz.
exactly. And that was a big but in terms of just feeling it right, and kind of like getting to that subtle difference between it being like on the grid in Pro Tools and being like in the right spot in the groove. There's a real difference, and that's the difference between a record that makes you want to dance and a record that
Yeah.
it maybe is acceptable, but ultimately for some reason it doesn't have the effect of something that's really groovy.
Yeah. But here's an interesting thing just to add to that. When I first realized, I would see friends of mine who I knew in Cuba for years, and then some
Mm-hmm.
of them would move to Montreal, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and I would notice that their playing would change a little bit. The edges would be gone; it would be more round. I don't know how to
Mm-hmm.
explain this, and I always thought that was interesting. And I only really kind of said to myself, okay, I have to ask Piloto, because we had the situation where I invited Piloto with Climax,
Yeah.
but he didn't bring up some of the musicians. So he only brought for this one specific project. He brought the rhythm section. He brought some of the musicians. But he did have with him some ex-musicians in his band who were already here, who went on with their lives, but they're still professional musicians.
Right.
So for this project, it was easier for us to do this way because it was kind of an in and out. So we put the band together which were all his ex-band members. But then when they had the rehearsal, the rehearsal for this, I noticed right away the difference. I could see the line of division, musical division line, the way the guys who just got off the plane
Mm.
to the guys who had been here for 5-6 years already.
Ah.
And I heard it, and I'm saying, is this my imagination? What I mean? So I asked Piloto, and I said, tell me, is there something that happens? Is there an evolution of the change of the way we play? And he looked at me, the Piloto famous smile. He just smiled and he goes, yes, for sure. And then we have to adjust, and then they see it right away because they're getting kicked.
Yeah.
You say
I
laid back. It may be not exactly the word, but
uh-huh.
I think I think we know what we mean. It's not as edgy. It's not as. It's
Yeah.
like this is the last time I'm going to play these notes. That's the way they play. It's
Yeah.
it's a there's a little bit. It's more comfortable, for lack of
Hmm.
a better word.
Interesting.
And not that they play any worse, or it's just different. But you notice this edge is
Yeah.
not there anymore once they left.
That is a really interesting concept. I think that every place has its kind of almost like a like a zeitgeist river, or whatever you want to call it. Like in LA, we do so much music for films, and we're always like, if you're a composer, you have to be so flexible, and all of a sudden you might be writing traditional Japanese folkloric music for something, and you have no idea what you're doing. So of course you're going to turn to your expert musicians and get a little help, and of course that's how you get it good, right? And we do it, but to some degree, because we got to move so fast, and because we're living in a super commercial world where people got to make stuff that sells, there is this trap of the music out here becoming kind of like a pastiche of everything, if you know what I'm saying. Like, people do it right. Like I'm very proud of that music, the musical Encanto. I think they did a really nice job. But a lot of times, there isn't the time or necessarily need to like really do the authentic thing, and that's a shame. So I think most composers, in my generation, like, we care about that, like, and that's a
Sure.
good thing. Like, we definitely care. It's not that no one didn't care in the past, but like, when you listen to Henry Mancini, for example, it's beautiful music. I love him. He's one of my favorite composers of all time. But it's not really, when he does a Latin track, it's not really Latin music. It's this thing. It's this other thing, and
It's
it's
the
cool.
flavor.
It's got like a touch of Latin flavor over a beautiful, string melody. Nothing against it, because it's classic. It's a classic take on music of the time. But I feel like people are more aware than they ever have been that if you're gonna do this music, you really want to do it correctly. If you're gonna make something that needs to be merengue, you're gonna do it right. You're gonna do it, for example. So that to me is obviously very important in my project because, because one thing I don't want to do is, call something Son Montuno and have it really not be that, because that just perpetuates kind of the wishy-washy understanding of all these cultural things. But at the same time, we can't be too rigid about it, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
so at this point in my project, having done 2 albums, I feel comfortable, honestly, enough having enough knowledge where I feel like I could play a little more and take things outside a little bit and push it a little bit, maybe not necessarily feel the need to be so strictly in you know a Cuban style,
Hmm.
kind of making it like, we can do something that brings in other elements. And, we just go back to the Duke Ellington principle. If it sounds good, it is good, but without undermining making it so you don't want to dance. Like, that's the most important thing.
Sure.
And I think that's the part that wasn't really explained to me when I was growing up about Cuban music. It's like, it's fundamentally dance music. It
Sure.
was born, right. I mean, that's not all Cuban music, but let's just say dancehall, right? So the Cuban music that was of the French influence, right? It
Yes.
was like society dance music.
Exactly.
And so when you do an arrangement for dancehall, if the rules are there because they want to keep the people dancing, right? And so as long as you have that in mind, it gives you a sense of like, okay, how can I, if I need to break one of the rules, will the consequence of breaking this particular detail be that people won't be able to dance this music anymore? And if that's the consequence, to me, then like, it's probably not a good idea to break that rule, because people will be listening, they'll be dancing, and then all of a sudden they'll sit down and be like, oh, okay, this is the part where we don't want to dance. And if,
Right.
if you're trying to make people dance to the music, then that would, I think, be a failure of the arrangement, right?
Right.
But
right.
So I guess I'm bringing this all up because, as you can see, I'm preoccupied with trying to push my project into an interesting way without undermining the I guess
The essence.
the groove and the structure. And so that's really the puzzle to sort out when you're working
Yeah.
on this stuff. Yeah.
I mean, all this music was dance music. I mean, the dance song was set up for the cha-cha to happen.
Right.
And the cha-cha is
Right.
definitely a dance. So I think if you stay true to the essence of the thing,
Mhm.
and
Yep.
and any music, there's going to be an evolution. It's not going to freeze in time. It can't, and it
Right.
shouldn't, and it can't
Right.
for a lot of reasons. Yeah. So
Yes. So
yeah.
totally. I think a lot about how to present music. So like I mentioned earlier, my goal is to make it so that everyone can kind of access this awesome music that I just love, right, from the Caribbean. And I have realized, with some Americans, when you say, "Oh, my project is classical meets Caribbean," the first thing they think of is either reggae or soca from Trinidad. That's a lot of people, and that makes sense, right? Those are the English-speaking Caribbean
Sure.
islands that probably most people are familiar with because maybe they've gone on vacation there, or they're familiar with Bob Marley, or other artists, right? So that's fine. So it takes a little more effort to explain, well, no, it's not that part of the Caribbean. I mean, when you say Cuban, of course, Americans are aware of that. But when you talk about maybe an island like Martinique, that's a little different, right? And when you talk about Venezuelan coast or Colombian coast, possibly that's a little different. But I feel like what I really like is trying to like bring the context to people, bring the island style or the Caribbean style to a context, into a context where people aren't afraid to go a little further. And this is a thing that we talk about in storytelling. You try to sort of seduce the audience with being, semi-opaque with your background information, right? Like, in Star Wars, when Luke Skywalker says to Obi-Wan, like, "Oh, you fought in the Clone Wars?" And he says, oh yes, the Clone Wars. And there's such good acting, and all of us as kids were just like, "What are the Clone Wars?"
Right.
This is that great storytelling technique where you give this backstory, like, so that your imagination just fires up, and everyone had an imagination of what the Clone Wars must have been until we actually got the movies about those later. And I want to do that with music, right? So you want people to listen to it, and there's like a mystery and there's like a story there. And
Yeah.
I feel that when you hear like a great singer like Cesaria Evora, for example, from Cabo Verde, when you hear her sing, to me, it's like she's singing with 1,000 years of history in your voice. And I barely understand Portuguese, but I'm fascinated. And to
Yeah.
me, whether it's vocal music or instrumental music, that's what I'm really looking for in the music. I want people to hear it and think there's like a deep thing there.
Yeah.
And you can't fake that. So you
No.
have to put that in the music somehow. And whether it's your own life or some non-tangible abstract thing that you love as a composer, you have to find a way to put that in the music. And to me, maybe what you were talking about with the Cubans who, are right off the island, they have a certain energy and a certain style, a certain sabor, right? And the guys who are in Montreal, well, their stories already changed, right? So
Of
like
course. Of
with the
course.
way they're playing, what they're bringing to their instrument, it's a different reflection. Maybe whether it's stress or heartache or relief or joy or something's there that might be a little bit different because their life is different now.
Well, yeah,
And so,
context has a lot to do with it. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah,
I mean,
and
what's important is, and what you're doing is you're transporting. So a listener's
yeah,
being transported to this other place,
hmm,
and I think that's like when Pavarotti would sing opera.
oh, totally,
Person who is totally not an opera buff, you
right,
listen to Pavarotti, you can't help it. He's transported you into this world,
exactly, exactly.
right?
And I think the best singers and artists do that. They transcend their own genre, and that's really when they're deeply connected. I think Juan Luis Guerra from the Dominican Republic does this. I think he's incredible, and he's of course probably the most famous merengue artist, but he's singing poetry, and he connects to people. Yeah, I find him to make really just excellent music that could touch everybody. And
Yeah,
that I think that is the goal. Like the
yeah,
goal is to you just get into the mesosphere and just be able to connect to every soul on earth, whether you're familiar with the music or not.
yeah.
I think that's the big goal. Yeah.
And I just had a flash as you were talking about this when we were in Paris, and we were rehearsing. Then we were in the studio
Mhm.
doing the final tracks for your album. And at one point, I had to have my espresso, of course. So the
Yes.
engineer, I said, where can I get the espresso? So you go out the door, go past this other studio, the other studio. There's a small studio on the other side.
Yeah.
Just go straight through, and it's at the end. You'll see it. So I went out, and then there's this guy. We cross paths. He looks at me, and we smile at each other like this. I was on a mission. I had to get my espresso. I was really. It had been like a few hours. So I get my espresso, and we crossed again, and then I said, "Gee, he looks familiar. He looks awfully familiar." And I said that this guy who's, he says, yeah, Mick Jagger's mixing in the studio next. And I said,
I
yes,
forgot that he was there the same day. That is so
yes.
amazing.
Yeah,
That's
it was
amazing.
funny because I said, gee, looks familiar, but
Yeah,
I had to get back because I didn't know if you were going back in, that kind of thing. I didn't want to linger.
yeah,
And then I realized, well, it was Mick Jagger who was there.
yeah.
But do you
Amazing.
remember another fun moment was when just before COVID, we played in Havana with repercussion with the
Yeah.
orchestra.
Right. Oh, that
And
was
then I
amazing.
reached out to you and I said, "Oh no, Joachim's got to be here." I reached out to you and I said, just throwing it out there.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be cool if you played Beethoven in
Yeah.
Havana with the orchestra there? That was fun. That was a lot of fun.
That was such a treat. It was such a great thing. I'm so glad we got to do that. That was a really beautiful, beautiful moment in a lot of ways. I feel like I had it was interesting to come back to Cuba and kind of after 3 years since the workshop had passed since we did that. It was just really interesting it's just a really fun to kind of was a great way to mark the learning of everything, you know, and reflect, and of course be extremely grateful to be with all those amazing musicians. And I don't know. I mean, let me ask you this question, Aldo. Like, if you could design, maybe it's too big a question to design the perfect world, but if you could design like a couple lofty musical goals for like 10 years from now, like where would you want things to go in terms of just music and culture and that kind of thing?
Yeah, very good question because I think about that all the time. So, number one, I would ask anybody who has like, $300 million, 5 million, 500, all who have done really well. What the world needs now is more culture, more education, which they're taking out of the schools and, like
Mm,
sports and music. And I think that's such a tragedy because we have, on the one hand, all the great technology that's developing. And now with
mm,
AI, I mean, we're at the threshold of a whole new world. But I
mm,
said there's one element that's going not unnoticed, but there should be a lot more time and energy and investment in is in educating musically in the creative period and start kindergarten like fund those programs like there's no tomorrow from day one and make the planet a much happier place by doing so. I
totally.
think I think those are the seeds that would need no, would need to be there. That would be one moving
Yeah.
forward. And I think
Okay.
that would change everything because technology is going to happen. We're going to embrace it. I mean, look, you're in Los Angeles, I'm in Montreal, and we're having this conversation.
Right.
There are technologies like the ELK system these people in Sweden developed where
Hmm.
you can perform live,
Yeah.
on internet,
Have you
from
tried that?
great.
Does it work well
Yeah,
yet? I
oh,
have.
absolutely,
Oh,
absolutely.
that's great.
It's
Yeah.
amazing. I'll send you the info on those guys. The limitation is you can't do it over 6,000 kilometers, for
Uh,
example. There's a
okay.
limit, maybe 1,500 miles or something like. I'm not sure
Uh,
yet, and I think
okay.
they're expanding that. But I've seen some of the other beta testing where somebody's in London, or another one in Naples or Turin or somewhere in Italy,
Hmm.
and piano player and bass player or piano player and an opera singer accompanying and totally following each other with
Yeah.
no issue, time issue, syncing whatsoever. So that's amazing. So imagine we have all of that, and it's going to get even more fantastic. I mean, it won't replace the live, but it gives us much more opportunity. But if we go to the ground level and just make people happier, more creative, regardless of what they end up doing, and keep the creative
Yeah.
and less robotic. I'm seeing that and it's scaring me. And I'm saying,
Yeah.
okay, now we have such great opportunity. Never in history have we had this much of everything and everything great. But we're cutting the trees so we don't really have a forest. We don't
Mm,
have that. And we need a much bigger forest, especially internationally with all the, you know, geopolitically wise.
yeah.
If you start that across the board. My other one would be, and this is something totally outrageous, but I would think would be so cool. Music is you've traveled a lot and you compose a lot and you're in these contexts that you explore, and I have also, where you can go anywhere on the planet, and musically you don't have to say a word. You can sit in with somebody, you can play right off the bat
Hmm.
in any language, and you don't have to speak because we have this universal language that we speak, right? So imagine training all these, everybody who's got it speaks this language, and you start a country called music country, our own passports,
Yeah.
and we're members of this tribe or this
Yeah.
whether we're from Japan, from China, from Cuba, from anywhere, and those people who are developing all those great things, and we're all paying attention, of course, because now the world is so small, and then we can move around freely, have our own place as musicians. the
Wow.
passport, musician's passport.
I love it. That sounds like I want to live in that world. That sounds amazing. That sounds amazing. But you make a good point. Obviously people are AI is the latest technological both innovation and panic, right? Everyone's panicking. Last year, social media was the innovation and the panic. And I think with all these things, I panic too. Don't get me wrong. I'm not downplaying. I'm not saying they're necessarily hysterical. There's obviously serious concerns, but hopefully, if we get our act together, we're getting to the point where we're kind of using these tools well. And I am actually, even though social media is really problematic and you have to be so careful because as musicians, we feel like we have to be on it, but it can like take your life away because these things are designed to preoccupy you. And it's just really destructive for focus and all those things that, we know and we don't have to get into right now. I guess what I'm hoping is that it'll reach somehow its potential of the value being the authentic thing. Like it's a beautiful thing when you just get a singer with his or her guitar and they're just singing into their phone, and it's a song that really is sincere because they haven't been to a studio really. They're just singing songs how they like, and they're singing about something that they're experiencing and they're putting it out there, and you feel it, and it's raw and you feel it, like that sort of thing. Those are the gems that could potentially be found and more. I think that's the like true potential of social media and music, I think.
Yeah.
And sometimes we get there, sometimes we get a lucky break that someone did something really hip and they get discovered, and the right person gets to the front of the queue. You know what I mean? And obviously, there's nothing against things that are well produced. It's not like that. It's just that when we see the real deal, I think a lot of us are just like, that's real. I don't know why, but that's real. And I still feel like that at the end of the day, that's all that we want. We want this like deeply honest, sincere expression in our art. And if we can get those things, I think we're happy as people. And when we don't get it, it's when we get like a lot of plastic music or super commercialized music, it's like, it doesn't feel good. It's like just being lied to all the time. It's like,
No, you're absolutely right. And that's why, my thing about across the board, I mean, if we just have programs everywhere on the planet, every school has an orchestra by the time they're 5 years old. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not really, because you want the creative, so then we can make the difference and distinguish between what is real and what is not real. And those who decide to go on further and go deeper into this, then they make something that is amazing because they've actually had time to do it and gone through the resources of the creativity process to get there.
Right. Amazing. Yeah.
Anyway, what moving forward? I mean, we could go on for a week.
Yeah.
And we'll have to do that live when I come and visit you, or you visit me here or in Calabria.
I'm due for a visit. I want to come up there. Yeah.
Oh, open invitation, sir.
Oh, yeah. All right. All right.
Like, what about you? Before we go, what would you see as the evolution? What would you see in general, but specifically to what you're doing? I know you're aside from working for all of these people and all of the music for film and series.
Yeah.
I mean, you're really good at it and you've established yourself. But from the creative, pushing yourself out there, because you are putting yourself out there and going out on a limb, which I really respect you for, by the way. That's fabulous. Where do you see that going?
So let me just describe the context of what's going on right now. Here we are in summer 2023. The writers in LA are on strike. The TV writers, and they need a better deal. And I think pretty much everybody wants them to get a better deal. And the reason what's going on is there've been a lot of changes since their last deal. Netflix and Hulu and Amazon and Apple TV, all these companies are fighting for your eyeballs, and it's very different than network TV and cable, which used to dominate. So you have a different way of consuming music, and film, I should say, consuming film and consuming film music, and the writers are trying to get a better deal. And in the meantime, all of us are hoping that it gets resolved, and so things go production kind of gets rolling again. And I think what I see, and this is an optimistic point of view, is the fight between the worker and labor is eternal, right? And there's different ways of looking at it. But I really feel that we have in the U.S. we talk about the big problem of inequity, right? That there's a lot of money at the top, and there's a lot of people who can't rise. And the whole promise of America is work hard, and you can make a good living for yourself. And that is getting harder and harder on the margins, and the middle class is hurting and all that stuff. I really feel that what I'd like to see is kind of less elitism. I mean, as you can see with the kind of music I'm creating, I'm very much an anti-elitist. Like, I really don't want there to be any status difference between music A and music B, right? I want everyone to be able to enjoy it all. But that is, I know it's impossible to live in a classless society. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that we try, but what I do think is what we should try to do is there should be more of an incentive to open the door to the guys who don't have as much. I really feel like this idea that there should be so much money at the top and just like nothing at the bottom. I think society's day by day is really getting the message that that's too much. That's too much. And I really feel I maybe it's an overly optimistic thing to say, given our political culture in general and how divisive things are. But I think that if people realize that ultimately this massive inequity has got to be dealt with, and it's not so hard to reach out, and whether you're reaching out culturally or economically, or just taking a curiosity in people that just don't have what you have. I think we get to a place where there's more overall opportunity, and it also requires a sort of mentality of abundance, not like I got to get mine and keep all my nuts so that I'm good for the winter and the other squirrels might starve, but at least I know I'm going to survive. This is not a good mentality, because we actually have abundance throughout the world. Like we it's a big challenge. It's not that we don't have the food. We have to figure out a way to give everybody access to it, and that is a huge problem, and it's obviously very nuanced, and everyone has to deal with it. But I guess what I'm saying is, with culture, if you can share culture, you can share your music of your culture, share your food of your culture, share your ideas and your clothing and your artwork of your culture. That is a way to kind of create empathy with other people. Say, wow, I don't have that guy's religion and that music I'd never heard, but it's pretty cool, and I really get how that person is living. To me, that's a very important thing that I feel like everybody needs to get. If you're not a musician, you can get that from traveling and just getting outside your comfort zone. And I feel like that is a really important way to sort of see that everybody should have a little more access to a path to rise. I guess, sure. And this is not like a political statement. It's more of a statement of just everybody should be able to get a shot if we can just kind of reach out to each other a little more. And so that's kind of my hope for the world, if it makes sense. It's a bit of a ramble, but that's kind of what I hope happens in the next 10 years. And I say that from the context of what's happening now, which is the writers want a better deal, and everyone kind of agrees. I think even the studio guys know, they're like, yeah, these writers, they need to get paid more. Sure. Now the devil's in the details with how it all gets negotiated, and obviously, business people who own the businesses and own the studios, they want the best deal from themselves. But I think there's a sense that hey, let's do right by these guys. Let's be fair. And as I haven't talked to anybody who thinks the writers, are overdoing it by asking for a better deal. I mean, pretty much everyone's like, yeah, they need a better deal. And that's different than past strikes. and that I've seen in my life. Like sometimes people are like, these guys, they already have it so good, and which is not necessarily true, but the vibe is, let's be fair. And I
Sure.
think that's reason to be optimistic.
Yeah, and I mean the world is changing rapidly,
Yeah.
and in some ways very good. So we have to adapt to that, and make it work for everybody.
Yeah.
And the thing is, like you say, another maybe a different way to say it, if everybody's good, then you're okay. If they're okay, then you're okay. It's not like if
Mhm.
I'm okay, then everybody's okay. No, it's really the other way around. If
Right.
everybody's okay, then you'll be okay.
Right. That
Almost by default,
that
if you
that is
want.
exactly it. That's what I think is the attitude of abundance. It's
Yeah,
like you give it out, you give, you lend a hand, you help out. You're not scared of your resources vanishing.
yeah.
And because the truth is, we have a way to make it work so that people can rise.
Yep.
So
On that note, yeah. No, seriously.
yeah.
And I mean, I think it's food for thought for sure. But I mean, like I said, we can go on forever about this. But I think it's a point well taken, certainly from in my part, and I think people understand that. The respect and understanding, a better understanding than you understand how things work, and make it work, because it can be. We're intelligent. We're really intelligent people on this
Yeah.
planet, and once people have a better understanding of things, then things work better. And
Mhm.
everybody has basically the same needs anyway, and those work harder or have other aspirations. Well, let them do that, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
But
Exactly.
I really want to thank you,
Thank
Joachim. We can
you.
go on for days, of course.
Yeah, yeah.
But
I love talking to you. This is like our phone calls, but
oh
video.
yes, yes, and then thank you so much for taking the time. I know how busy you are,
I
and
appreciate it.
we'll have to do this again,
Hey,
and in person, of course.
absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
and
Well,
as I always say, to be continued.